In this message, I want to talk about the shocking roots of anti-Semitism. We're all familiar with the biblical battles between Israel and Palestine dating back to the Old Testament times. In those days, they were called the Canaanites and the Philistines, the Palestinians. They had little tribes, the Amorites, the Moabites, the Edomites. They were everywhere fighting against Israel. And this conflict took place beginning around 1000 BCE, 1,000 years before Jesus. Then in 700 BCE, the Assyrians and Babylonians, another biblical name for the Palestinians, attacked Israel. And they took them into exile and destroyed Solomon's temple. You're probably familiar with all of that history. There was bad blood for 3,000 years between Israel and the Palestinian people. But in a more modern sense, and that's what I want to talk to you about in this message, and this will surprise you. The roots date back to a deeply anti-Semitic Roman Catholic Church at the time of the Crusades. Now, I'm going to need to talk about the Roman Catholic Church 1,000 years ago, not the Catholic Church today, but 1,000 years ago. In 1096, Pope Urban II decided to free the Holy Land from the Muslims and the Jews. We often hear about attacking the Muslims and freeing Jerusalem from the Muslims, but we don't hear much about the fact that Urban said the Jews have to go as well. There were 8 crusades, so that by 1200, Pope Innocent declared the Jews were blasphemers. They had blasphemed Jesus Christ. So therefore, he said by 1200, they cannot hold any public office. We have to identify them publicly, and they have to wear special clothing. This is 1200 AD. So the Crusades started this long tradition of organized violence by the church against the Jews in Europe. They were denied citizenship. They were segregated into certain areas of the town. The goal was to eliminate the Jewish population in Europe by either conversion to the Catholic faith or by deportation or by simply killing them. Well, by the Middle Ages, the Jews controlled the banks and the lending institutions of many countries, like the areas of Germany, cities like Wittenberg in Germany, which we visit on a trip that I'll share with you. And these cities in Germany began accusing the Jews of poisoning the water sources, the wells of the cities. See, if a well got poisoned in a city, there was no drinking water. So this anti-Jewish sentiment grew, and it got very, very strong. There's a historic presence of the Roman Catholic Church saying that Jews don't belong in Germany or in Europe. And there were Jewish expulsions. They tried to get rid of the Jews in England in 1290, in France in 1300, in Germany in 1350, in Spain in 1492. You all may be familiar with the Spanish Inquisition. The Spanish Inquisition killed 300,000 Jews. And Germany had more Jews than any other country in Europe. And they were accusing the Jews of poisoning the wells. Whether they were or not, we don't know, but they were accused of that. And then there's Russia. The leaders in Russia embraced the teaching later of Marx and Engels, which taught that Judaism was not a religion, it was a philosophy. And its goal was to control the land, the labor, and the people. It's no surprise when Hitler came to power, he had the heritage of an anti-Jewish culture already built for him to run with in what he wanted to accomplish. When we do our Luther Germany trips, and they're really, I call them words, wars, and walls. They're about the power of the human word, Luther and Hitler, power of wars, World War I, World War II, and walls, the Cold War. And during those trips, we visit Buchenwald concentration camp. It was the first concentration camp liberated by the American soldiers. If you've seen the movie The Band of Brothers, there's a scene in Ettersburg, 4 miles northwest of Weimar, which is liberated by the Americans. But it was a concentration camp beginning in 1937. It was freed and liberated in April 11th of 1945 by the 6th Armored Division of George Patton. And he found 250,000 prisoners there. What he saw was horrific. Edward R. Murrow, maybe you remember him, a journalist at the time, said, "I pray you believe what I said about Buchenwald. I've reported what I saw and heard, but only part of it. For most, I have not words." And after the war, by the way, Buchenwald was occupied by the Soviet Union from 1949 to 1990 until the wall fell 41 years later. They imprisoned people in that concentration camp. You can still see the bunkers of the Cold War and the guilt and the inferior feelings when we take our trip of the East German people. We tend to think of Germany as a united country, but it's deeply divided between Western Germany, which was freed in the Cold War, and Eastern Germany, which was held by the Soviets behind the walls, in which a Bible, Christianity, and the speaking of English was strictly prohibited. So how did we get here? How did all this happen, both back in history and in modern day, in our modern day world? Well, let me step back to 1914 to 1918, World War I. Germany wanted to take out France. They expected a quick victory, but instead of a quick victory, they lost a costly war, which toppled the German government. In 1919, they signed the Peace Treaty of Versailles, which inflicted a high price tag of reparations on the German people and a punishment of the German people for starting that war and the damage that they caused. But these reparations and this punishment, it served as political fodder for the German people. Now, in 1919 to 1933, the German people tried to establish what they called the Weimar Republic, a democratic state. They wanted to be democratic. But in 1929, there was this worldwide depression that took place. Coupled with the immorality of the German people, they were blurring sexual distinctions and sexual boundary lines. Transsexuality was in vogue and had a high rise of favor among the people. It was really an androgynous society where is actually no sex. It's just one sex, the same sex. Yeah, so there's a lot going on. Now, at the same time, there's this Bavarian paper hanger who joins a German Workers' Party, who fights for the wages and the rights of the German people. He rises to leadership. When he does, they change the name of that party to the Nationalist Socialist German Workers' Party, Nazi for short. It was primarily started as a labor union. This fellow by the name of Adolf Hitler becomes the leader. He attempts a coup of the government and lands in prison, where he writes a book called Mein Kampf, My Struggle, My Political Ideology. So around 1930, the Nazi Party is rising to power. Protestant President von Hindenburg appoints Adolf Hitler as chancellor and spokesperson, because Hitler had these great speaking gifts and von Hindenburg didn't. And many of the clergy of the day applauded what was taking place in the government. Now, listen to this. They pass what is called the Enabling Act, which gives the government enormous power over the media and over education. If you look at the kids in those days, they're all running around in brown little school outfits of the Nazis. The population of Germany in 1933 was around 60 million people, 40 million Protestants, 20 million Catholics, 1%, 60,000 Jews. But it's the Jews they saw as the problem. So in 1929, Hitler began to talk about the final solution, the way to free our country, to be solid culturally and politically, eliminate the Jews. So the National Socialist German Workers' Party organized patriotic events. They gathered in the patriotic Protestants with a campaign against anybody who was against labor. Now the people, they thought of the Nazis as the lesser of two evils. So all of this is brewing at one time. You have the reparations, the punishments, Great Depression, the rise of an androgynous society, a lack of morals, and you have this Bavarian paper hanger who's a great speaker who says, I can solve your problems for you. Now the question becomes, so where was the church during this time? What are they thinking over all of this time? Well, the attitudes and actions of the German Catholic and Protestant churches during the Nazi era were shaped by the backlash against the war reparations and the political, economic, and social changes that were occurring in their culture. During the anti-communist nationalism in 1933, most German Christians welcomed the rise of the Nazi Party. They were encouraged by Article 24 of the 1920 Nazi Party Statement of Positive Christianity. They wrote a statement about Christianity being positive, and here's what it said. We demand freedom of religion for all religious denominations within the state, so long as they do not endanger its existence or oppose the moral sense of the Germanic race. The party, as such, advocates the standpoint of positive Christianity. Without binding itself confessionally to any one denomination, the party combats the Jewish materialistic spirit within and around us, and are convinced that a permanent recovery of our people can only be achieved from within on the basis of the common good before the individual good. So, where was the church? Well, let's look at the Protestant church briefly, then I want to get into the Catholic church, which was the real root of the problems. In the Protestant church, it was called the National German Evangelical State Church, the state church. It viewed itself as one of the pillars of German culture. It was the theological tradition to be loyal to the state in terms of how the church saw itself. And within that church, the Protestant church, there were two separate parties, the German Christian church and the German confessing church. The German Christian church embraced many aspects of the Nazi nationalistic racial ideology. They wanted to create a national church that supported a Nazified version of Christianity led by a political leader. On the other hand was the German confessing church. They emerged in opposition to the German Christian church. Their founding document, the Barmen Declaration of Faith, was written by a Swiss theologian by the name of Karl Barth. He was against the German Christian church. He declared church allegiance was to God and Scripture, not a worldly political leader. Having said that, the German confessing church remained a part of the German evangelical church, which resulted in a debate within the church between the Nazified German church and the confessional church. Both sides decided that the priority was to avoid conflict with the Nazis. So most church leaders were conservatives that didn't want to take the risk of losing the privileges of church connection with the state. In this sense, the church was monastic, reservationist. It refused to get involved in political events. Now, at the same time, many lay people retreated from the church because they felt it wasn't doing its job, that it should remain the church, preaching morality, preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ. Okay, let's talk about the Roman Catholic Church, and this is where things get a little dicey. Now remember, we're talking about the Roman Catholic Church during the days of World War II. The dean of Magdeburg Cathedral said about the Catholic Church flying Nazi flags in the church, he said, "Whoever reviles this symbol of ours is reviling our Germany. The swastika flags around the altar radiate hope that the day is at last about to dawn." But it wasn't a day. It was a great darkness of the church history, a day of darkness in church history. One priest wrote, "Hitler became, as it were, the wonderful transparency for our time, the window of our age, through which light fell on the history of Christianity. Through him, we were able to see the Savior in the history of the Germans." Now, before 1933, some bishops prohibited Catholics in their diocese from joining the Nazi Party. But the ban was dropped after Hitler's 1933 speech, in which he described Christianity as the foundation for German values. We can often see photos of Catholic clergy and Nazi officials, including Joseph Goebbels, giving the Nazi salute in the church. But in Rome, Pope Pius XII is still criticized for failing to speak out more publicly against the Nazi atrocities. Now, let me wrap this up. Protestants and Catholics together, they become bystanders. The general tactic of the Protestant and the Catholic Church was caution. There was no public opposition to anti-Semitism or sanctions against the Jews. They simply wanted to coexist with the Nazi state. Now, there were individual Catholics and Protestants who became involved in rescue and resistance activity, but the church leaders, the church leadership, and most ordinary Christians remained remarkably silent. When Germany went to war in September 1939, Protestants and Catholics joined the military. They wore belt buckles that said two things on them: the swastika and the traditional German military claim, God with us. God with us. And many American soldiers brought those belt buckles back home with them. But there was one group that refused to compromise: the Jehovah's Witnesses. They were imprisoned. They refused to serve in the military or give the Nazi salute. So church leaders were largely in retreat in fear of the Nazis. They complained in private, but when details of the final solution became public, most Christians were bystanders. Now, when we're on those trips, we're all standing there and we're upset because the German people in the church didn't speak up. But imagine, it's one thing if I were just a single guy and I took my stand and I died, I was killed for my stand of Christianity against the Nazis. That's one thing to understand. But what if they said, hey, we don't care about you. We're coming to take your kids. We're going to take them. You're never going to see them again. I mean, things can get really nasty, and it's easy to judge and evaluate through the lens of our modern day world of what was taking place then. But at that time, it was very, very, very scary. I like the words of Israeli scholar Yehuda Bauer in 1998. He was invited to speak before Germany's parliament. And he said, I come from a people who gave the 10 Commandments to the world. He told the legislatures, time has come to strengthen them by 3 additional commandments, which we ought to adopt and commit ourselves to. Thou shalt not be a perpetrator, thou shalt not be a victim, and thou shalt never, but never be a bystander. What a message for our culture. Thou shalt never, but never be a bystander. During the 12 years of the Third Reich, Christians broke each of Bauer's commandments. A few sacrificed their life for their liberty, and I have a message on that. They sacrificed themselves and their families and their children to resist the Nazi iniquity. But the vast majority of German Christians fell along the spectrum between perpetrator and bystander. Holocaust scholar Victoria Barnett writes, the genocide of the European Jews would have been impossible without the active participation of bystanders to carry it out and failure to intervene to stop it. So what about us? I mean, where would we stand? It's easy to have snap answers. Oh, I'd have taken my stand. But what if they'd have taken your 5 or 6-year-old child, or taking your kids out of school and you've never seen them again? What would you do? These are good questions. I don't have answers, by the way. I probably would have been a bystander, if you want to know the truth. Difficult issues. But I want you to understand that this anti-Semitism started 3,000 years ago, and then we had the Crusades, and then we had these world wars, and we had the reparations and the punishment of the German people, and it gets so complicated and so difficult. And in the midst of that, the question I ask myself, and it's a question I want you to ask yourselves, is this. So what was God trying to say to us when all of that evil was taking place, starting with the Crusades? What was God trying to say? What's he trying to teach us about good and evil and about our role in that and being bystanders or victims or perpetrators? And what's he trying to tell us, you and me, individually? Let's start there and not with our nation. What's he trying to tell you and me individually about our role in our families, with our friends, in our community, and in our country today? I don't have any answers to preach to you. I'm asking you the question. What is God trying to say to you about what's happening in our world today?